It's that time again. Welcome, everyone. I'm Angela Black. This show is called At This Moment here at Revolution Radio, freedomslips.com, the number one 100% listener-supported radio station on the planet and possibly beyond. And so if you are colonizing Mars in the near future, bring your Wi-Fi because we're there too. And the way to keep this truth boat floating, of course, is to find the donate button at the side of the chat room, freedomslips.com, or the site support tab at the top of the homepage. And you can find yourself donating to the cause and receiving amazing prizes on the back end, including the subscription to the archives. I'm telling you, you're going to want to catch the archive to this show because there's going to be a lot of information discussed. I can't wait to tell you who my guest is, keeping it a secret for the next 1 minute. So anyway, you can subscribe to the archives for $5 a month. There are 2 studios going simultaneously all day long. And if you're a normal human who has one brain and a life, it's hard to listen to both studios at the same time. So for a mere $5 a month, you can subscribe and catch all the shows you missed yesterday, last week, last month, last year. How could you go wrong? And a special shout out to Nighthawk, the owner of the station here at Revolution Radio, all of the production staff, of course, the management staff. Hello, homies. What's up? And of course, my chatters. What's up? Not my chatters. I'm just one of you guys. But anyway, we're the chat room and it's a lot of fun. Hello to everyone out there and tune in on iTunes, Winamp, TalkStream Live, Shoutcast, however you find us. Hello, nice to see ya. And let's see, don't I look great on radio? I just want to say that. No. Okay, moving on. You can also look at the seed packs. Don't forget about those. You've got the $60 donation. You get yourself a bevy of seeds. The $100 most popular one-time donation does get you 34,500 seeds. And yes, you know what that means? Self-sufficiency. Correct. All right. And unfortunately, the seeds that we're going to be talking about in the next 2 hours are not included in that seed pack, but maybe one day, just maybe one day they will be. I think you know what I'm talking about. Also, I would like to thank JP, Wolfman J, JP Prometheus over at Wolf Spirit Radio for simulcasting this show right now. Shout out to you, man. Thanks so much for bringing more radio to my day and everyone's day. You did a great job there taking over for Dave Corso, and the place wouldn't be the same without you, as you are working for both sister stations here. Vinny Eastwood in the house, looking at him right there in the chat room. Vinny, you're hanging out here at Revolution Radio again. Sounds like you want to come home. All right, so anyway, just teasing. But you guys, Vinny Eastwood, and I'm honored, by the way, just honored to have received a random, out of the blue Skype text from Vinny Eastwood saying, Angela, I've got a guest to send your way. Would you mind interviewing him? And I immediately said yes and knew that I would have a high caliber, amazing person with me in the virtual studio right now. And indeed I do. I got to watch the documentary today. I'm learning more and more. And so without further, and just to everyone I did not name in the chat room, you guys know I love you. And hopefully we can do that maybe at the top of the second hour. So I can't tell you how excited I am to introduce my guest to you. And it is not mispronounced, so I'm not going to mispronounce his name. And he is the filmmaker and creator of the documentary called Drug Lord, and his name is Arik Reiss. And so welcome to the show, Arik.
Thanks for having me, Angela.
Nice to see ya. All right, so you guys, now this gentleman is a citizen of 3 countries, so he's no slouch. He's all over the planet all the time, and it took him, I think, 4 years to do this documentary, and he didn't stop and take a rest like most people would do. He's continuing on his filmmaking journey and making the sequel to Drug Lord as we speak. Well, a little later on in the day. It is 5 o'clock in the morning in Israel right now, where I am talking to Arik, and it's very exciting. Many people might pronounce his name Arik Reiss, but indeed that is incorrect. So I want to say it right here so you guys can all say it with me. Let's do it together. Arik Reiss, the filmmaker of the movie Drug Lord, a wonderful documentary about the history of cannabis, and it's pawn piece, if you will. It's chess piece in the American war on drugs and how New Zealand became, unfortunately, a victim of just a lot of technocracy and a lot of government corruption, etc., corporatocracy, all kinds of things. So we're going to get into the history of everything, but I just let's start here. So you're in Israel right now, and what the heck are you doing there, Arik?
I'm here to meet with several of their scientists who are the pioneers in the field of medical cannabis, principally Raphael Meshulam, who's the discoverer of the THC molecule and the anandamide component of the human body, which is the cannabinoid that the human body produces naturally. Whether or not you've ever smoked a joint or had a medible, you have cannabinoids coursing through your body throughout the entire length of your life. In fact, there's even cannabinoids in your mother's milk. So it's part of the human physiology. And the Israeli medical program discovered that. And they're using cannabis with amazing results to treat a number of diseases that previously were very difficult to treat.
Wow. And that using the cannabinoid, is that how you say it? Which is a molecule? Okay.
Well, yes. Principally, that's the active component of the cannabis plant. There are about 60 to 65. They're discovering new ones every day, but there are about 65 cannabinoids that they know of now, and each one has got a medicinal application.
Wow. That's really interesting. I know a little about some of this stuff, but I really look forward to the next 2 hours to learning a lot. So I didn't know that the human body has cannabinoid. Did I say it right?
Cannabinoid?
Cannabinoid. Okay, I got it. Cannabinoid. Do. So it's in our bodies. And so that means it's not, an elite molecule of the cannabis plant.
Well, yeah, it's a curious thing that the human body, in fact, almost all mammals, I should say, and birds as well, and a lot of different other life forms on this planet, they all have cannabinoids in them because we share a common ancestor, that being the humble sea squib. And because we evolved over millions of years from sea squibs, we have this component in our bodies, and it's a very interesting coincidence that the cannabis plant produces a molecule that exactly mimics what we have internally.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And so, yeah, it's just a very strange coincidence of nature that a plant is producing the same molecules that we actually need for life. Without cannabinoids in our body, we'd actually die. The endocannabinoid system is the most extensive network in the body. There's cannabinoid receptors in almost every part of your body, from your skin to your lungs, obviously, to your brain. Your heart has cannabinoid receptor sites. It's an incredible system, and it regulates many of our bodily functions.
Wow. So obviously, if, say, through environmental factors or illness, etc., that this molecule and this recepticide, as you called it, yes, recepticide, did you say?
Yes, there are cannabinoid receptor sites which fit the cannabinoid molecules. That's correct.
Right. And so maybe a depletion of that happens somehow. So instead of using, say, poisonous pharmaceuticals, which we're going to get into that, people, the replacement of these cannabinoids in our body, it makes perfect sense. Yes? I mean, hello.
Yes, absolutely. Well, take spasticity, for example. That's caused by deficiency in cannabinoids. So when cannabinoids are introduced artificially through eating cannabis, through smoking it even, or vaporizing it, or you can even inject cannabis now. That's one of the things that the Israeli medical program has pioneered.
Wow.
Those receptor sites then become filled with cannabinoids, and spasticity stops or is greatly reduced. So they're finding that it treats things like epilepsy far more effectively than pharmaceutical medications, and with fewer side effects, actually.
Of course. So it's called spasticity?
Oh, spasticity.
Oh, spasticity, like spasta. Spasticity. Like, yeah. One of my nicknames in high school was Spangy for Spastic Angie. So I see. So that's very interesting. Spasticity. Okay. So now let me ask a question before we continue to get rolling. We have the, the CBD aspect of which I think is the cannabinoid molecule that you're talking about. And then there's also the THC side. And I'm wondering if you can elaborate about the separation and how you see the separated items being cures or helping treat ailments, etc. What do you find with all your research that is the case? What do you see with the two? Yes, please ask. Please answer. I'll ask.
Well, of all the 65 cannabinoids, THC and CBD seem to be the main two. THC was the first one to be isolated by Professor Meshulam, and that's the one that typically gets you high and gives you the feeling of euphoria. And CBD, on the other hand, has no psychotropic effect. So you can smoke a CBD-rich joint or strain, and you won't feel the giggles or the munchies or any of those other symptoms of smoking cannabis ordinarily. Mm-hmm. And so this is a very positive development, because a lot of opponents of cannabis as medicine say, well, we can't use it because it'll get you high, as if that's a bad thing. Right. But if you're talking about CBD, there are no psychotropic effects, so you can use it without any fear, if that's the right word, of the psychological effects of normal cannabis. And also you can use it very safely with children. So they've discovered that it's extremely good for treating epilepsy. And so much so that the first person in the entire history of New Zealand since cannabis was made illegal in 1927 was recently given permission to use it. So there was a historic moment just a couple of weeks ago. Wow. When a teenager who was in an induced coma because his epileptic seizures were so severe that he was in danger of dying from them, he's been given permission by the Ministry of Health for the first time to use CBD oil that came from the United States, and he's responded very well to it. He's now out of his coma. He's opened his eyes for the first time in several weeks, and he's able to talk. So although the dosages are still very low, and they're going to increase them progressively, he has responded very well to the CBD oil.
Wow, that's great. Now, Suzanne Posel, who is a friend of Vinny's, they're cohorts over on American Freedom Radio, and I've had her on my show. As a matter of fact, she was on last week. She's a powerhouse of an individual. I'm a big fan of hers. She has a website called OccupyCorporatism.com, and she has, with her husband, started a company with crystal pure CBD, and it's the purest form of CBD, without the black paste, junk or whatever. And openly talks about the fact that her child was seizure ridden, if you will, and does use the CBD oil, and she's quite comfortable with that, and so yeah, I've heard good things, and from the few people I've talked to regarding the CBD cannabinoid that we're talking about here, it is. It gives you a sense of well-being of sorts. So if somebody is inhaling, say, some oil or something like that, and that treats, whatever, maybe stress, obviously seizures and different treatments for many things, that people go through, afflictions that people go through. So you're saying that THC and CBD are only two of 60 to 65?
That's
that right?
Wow. That's correct. I should point out that CBD is an antipsychotic. It's kind of like the balancing counterbalance, I should say, for THC. So it's very good to have both present in the strain. But where you take the CBD out completely and have a very high THC level, because as you increase the THC, the CBD decreases. So then you're getting into the varieties of cannabis that are typically sold on the street, which have been known to cause some problems. For example, skunk, which is very high in THC, can often cause people to spin out a little bit, and has the potential to induce psychotic episodes amongst certain people. So the presence of CBD is actually very important. In order for people to have, a good experience, there should actually be some CBDs present if they're smoking cannabis recreationally or medicinally, for that matter, or taking it in whichever form they like.
Balance in nature, in other words.
yeah, absolutely. Okay. I mean, the plant has got all kinds of tricks up its sleeve that are yet to be discovered. So CBD is just the tip of the iceberg.
Wow, and that's exciting and amazing. I'm a little in shock by that. I really had no idea that that there was so much more to the plant. And okay. So now, I was watching your documentary today, and I came across 3 words of which I pretty much thought were one and the same. So we're looking at hemp, we're looking at cannabis, and we're looking at marijuana. Now, would you help define if there is any difference at all between those three plants? And I did watch it, so I know what the marijuana issue is, but I would love for you to explain to the audience what's going on in the world of marijuana. Of cannabis.
Sure. Well, the term marijuana was actually introduced to the United States by Randall Hearst, the newspaper magnate,
yes,
who adopted it as a replacement term for cannabis, because prior to that, there were only 2 main words that we used in the United States to describe the plant. One was hemp, which was used to describe the the plant that was grown for industrial uses, and the other was cannabis, which was used to refer to the same genus of plant, but where it's grown for medicinal purposes. And then along came Randall Hearst, and he wanted to destroy the reputation of cannabis and hemp, particularly hemp, because it threatened his paper industries. He owned huge swathes of forest, which
William Randolph Hearst. Yes, William Randolph Hearst. Yes.
Yes, William Randolph Hearst. And he owned huge forests which were supplying his wood pulp paper mills that supplied the newsprint for his newspapers. And because of the invention of new hemp technology, it was becoming increasingly cheaper to make paper out of hemp. And so he wanted to destroy the competition, and he did this by running scare stories about cannabis, calling it marijuana, which was a fairly unknown or little known Mexican term for it, so that people didn't actually understand that he was talking about cannabis and hemp. They thought it was some new thing from Mexico. Mexican killer loco weed was how he was referring to it, and calling it marijuana and other sort of slang terms to denigrate the reputation of the plant. And it worked so well that people who were actually growing the plant themselves, hemp farmers in Missouri and in Kentucky and in Wisconsin, read these stories and jumped on the reefer madness bandwagon and joined in the furore to ban the cannabis plant, not knowing that they themselves were actually growing this plant, but they were calling it hemp. And so it was a very good propaganda campaign that he launched against cannabis. And the term marijuana is now more popular in the United States than the term cannabis. In fact, there's kind of a campaign to reintroduce the term cannabis because it has a much more medicinal connotation to it than the word marijuana. Marijuana is something, that we typically associate with recreational usage, and cannabis is the term that people are using now to give it its medical status back, because at one time it was the world's most important medicine. It was in half the medicines in the world during the 1800s. Yeah. So, it was William Randolph Hearst that actually introduced that term via Mexico to America.
And he was not the pillar of honest journalism. William Randolph Hearst is basically the initiation of tabloid journalism to the United States. So he definitely utilized his power and power of communication and print media to serve his own purpose, which obviously would be to continue to sell newspapers and keep his forests supplying his paper for the newspaper so he could sell, that stuff. And I know that he was, quote unquote in bed together with different people that had causes. And so we're going to get into that. Let's, okay, and just to let everyone know, the film came out January 24 of 2015. And so we're talking, just a few months ago. And normal people, Arik, normal people rest after that. But apparently you decided not to. And I know you put 4 years of your life into the Drug Lord documentary. And now you're working on Drug Lord 2, which is very exciting. And I want to give the listeners a quick link. You did put it in the chat room, and I see that you're in there, so that's great. I believe you can just go to druglord.com and download the film for $4.20 appropriately, $4.20.
Perfect. I should just point out that it's not spelled drug lord in the typical way. It's DRUGLAWED.
Right.
.com.
Right.
Like outlaw.
Yes, like outlawed. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay, so go to druglord.com, and that's LAWED. And you guys can download the film for $4.20, which is absolutely awesome and appropriate. Okay, so without them viewing it, why don't we give them a synopsis of what you covered, which was, it's a 2-hour film, I think, or almost, I think it's 95, 97 minutes, something like that, I think, is it?
Yes, it's 99 minutes long.
Nice.
Basically it discusses how New Zealand got rolled up in the US drug war along with 183 other countries. I kind of looked at New Zealand as a springboard to explain how the same thing happened with all of the countries that signed on to the drug war via the UN conventions that were actually sculpted by a man named Harry Anslinger, who was the first drug czar in the United States. And Harry Anslinger was one of the co-conspirators along with William Randolph Hearst that created the hysteria that is still around today that we call reefer madness. Yeah. I don't know if people have actually seen the original Reefer Madness film, but it's hysterically funny. Today we look at it and we laugh. But back then, people were quite convinced that what they were seeing was almost a documentary representation of people beating each other to death after smoking a single joint and committing all kinds of crimes. And there was this almost religious fervor that cannabis was going to, or marijuana as they were referring to it, was going to destroy Western society by causing waves of violent crime and the destruction of America's youth. And there was a whole spat of films that were put out at that time that were actually partially funded by liquor distilleries who didn't want competition from another recreational drug. And so these films were actually adopted as fact, and they show the most ridiculous scenes of women smoking marijuana and then stripping off their clothes and having an orgy. I wish marijuana did that to women. Unfortunately, it just doesn't have those effects. You're
hanging out with the wrong girls then. Just kidding.
And other scenes where, it causes all kinds of mad rages and people attacking each other. And, these films make us laugh today, but back then, people didn't know any better, and they thought, oh my goodness, this is actually happening. We have to do something about this. And in 1937, Harry Anslinger testified in Congress that there are 100,000 marijuana smokers in the U.S., most are Filipinos and Negroes and entertainers. Their marijuana usage causes them to rape white women and play jazz music. This is his actual testimony in Congress. And after 90 seconds of discussion, Congress in 1937 agreed to sign his Marijuana Tax Act, and that became the first federal prohibition of cannabis. And it was all basically a smoke and mirrors ploy to ban hemp because of its industrial properties, which were threatening the chemical industry, they were threatening the pharmaceutical industry, they were threatening the paper industry, and they were threatening the petroleum industry. So very powerful men, amongst them Harry Anslinger's uncle-in-law, who was the Treasury Secretary at that time, Andrew Mellon, these powerful men decided, well, we're going to gang up against hemp by denigrating its cousin cannabis, or marijuana as they called it, and make it illegal. And the Marijuana Tax Act did exactly that, and without a tax stamp, which the government wasn't issued, it was illegal to grow any form of cannabis, including hemp. Except just a few years later, when World War II began, they had to do a very quick about turn because they needed hemp for the war effort. So then they started encouraging hemp. The movie Hemp for Victory was released by the U.S. Department of Agriculture, which explained how useful it is and how vital it was for farmers to grow hemp. So they re-legalized it during the war, and then as soon as the war was over, they reintroduced the Marijuana Tax Act and banned it again. So it just goes to show their hypocrisy, and that from one minute to the next, they can change their minds about cannabis depending on their needs.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. I was, as I was taking notes throughout the documentary, I highly recommend everyone watch this documentary, and take notes. It's really a fascinating, concise history on a lot of things, including, interests in the alcohol industry, interests in the, tobacco industry, and then of course, a history of cannabis and where it, stands today, including the U.S. being now the forefront runner on legalizing, marijuana for recreational use, when it was actually the instigator of the war on drugs, which was a global war. So yeah, definitely everyone, it's druglawd.com. Filmmaker Arik Reiss is with me right now, and it's druglawed.com. And you guys get this, you can download it for $4.20. So I really recommend it. And Drug Law 2 is coming out soon. So, okay, I'm flipping back. Oh yeah, so the one word I kept writing, besides the word cannabis throughout the whole documentary, was hypocrisy. I just kept writing it down because it was so blatant. There is so much hypocrisy from the get-go, and it has nothing to do with the health benefits or negative effects supposedly of the marijuana plant or cannabis plant. It's really all about money. It's really, and what's weird is it became ineffective, and we're going to get in this. I'm going to actually kind of go page by page and just like peruse through the order of the documentary, because I'm going to get all over the place. So let's go back to, we have a wonderful lady in our chat room who's a manager here at Revolution Radio, and her name is V. Aubert, and that's because her last name is Aubert. And I'm sorry if I'm not supposed to tell you anyone that, but the point is that Suzanne Aubert is the let's see, if you could tell me what her title was. If you want to give me some history on Suzanne Aubert, aka I believe Mother Mary Joseph.
That's correct.
Yeah.
Mother Mary Joseph Aubert was a French nurse who became a nun and then founded the Catholic order, the Daughters of Our Lady of Compassion in New Zealand, which is the only homegrown Catholic order in New Zealand. And she introduced cannabis to New Zealand in the late 1800s. She brought the seeds with her from Europe because she knew about the medicinal benefits of the plant. And she was growing it on the hillside farm beside her church on the Wanganui River, which was at that time a very remote area in the wilds of New Zealand. And she used the proceeds of not just her cannabis medications, but her other medications as well, that she was selling all over the world, but particularly in England, Australia, and New Zealand. The profits from these medications actually funded the establishment of her order, which then went on to build schools and hospices and hospitals and orphanages. So she is currently being beatified as a saint by the Pope for her incredibly good deeds. And it's the one thing that's standing in her way is the fact that she grew and distributed enormous quantities of cannabis medications. So they view that as a problem, and they're not sure what to do with it because it contradicts their current position on drugs. The Pope has come out in favor of the war on drugs and in favor of the criminalization of cannabis. So he's in a bit of a position now that one of the people that he's actually beatifying as a saint currently was a proponent of cannabis. And it's going to be interesting to see if that actually stands in her way of becoming a saint.
Yeah, that will be very interesting. I wonder, he's an interesting pope. We'll put it that way.
Yeah, I like some things he says. I don't like the institution of religion in general, but I'm in favor of some of the things he says. But when it comes to the war on drugs, he's a big proponent of it, which I don't like at all. Right.
Well, a lot of them are definitely working together behind the scenes. So, okay, now, interestingly, so Suzanne, Mother Mary Joseph Aubert was practicing medicinal treatment and growing cannabis in the 1800s, late 1800s. Is that correct?
Up until her death in 1926, she was active right up until her death in her 90s. She was actually prescribing the cannabis to her nuns for all kinds of ailments, including menstrual cramps. So it's very likely that she even used it herself. And in New Zealand, it was very popular up until her death. They were putting it in their lemonade, actually. They were putting cannabis resin in their drinks. So it's almost certain that she herself used it as well.
And then, interestingly, they put the ban on marijuana the year after her death. The ban on cannabis, I should say.
That's right. It's just a strange coincidence, I think. I don't think they were waiting for her to die to do it, because it was actually a League of Nations treaty that the U.S. Drafted in 1925, which New Zealand signed in 1927, the Opium Treaty, which bundled cannabis into it because, again, mainly for racist reasons, that was how cannabis became illegal in many countries, but in New Zealand it was adopted in 1927, the year after she died.
It is very interesting. Maybe coincidental. Who knows? All right. And so the film then jumps and makes a quote from the Prime Minister of New Zealand in 1984 to 1989, who basically called out the hypocrisy of it all, said that anyone who was with a country that drinks as much as New Zealand does, and we'll get into that obviously as the show rolls along. I come from one of the drinkinest states in the United States, which is Wisconsin. So I'm familiar with alcohol being a part of the daily world, as is and I'm certainly not going to just signify only Wisconsin, but I come from a drinker's state, which is very interesting. Anyway, so in 1984, this man David Lang was the prime minister, and he said that with a country that drinks I'm paraphrasing, with a country that drinks as much as we do, or New Zealand does, that and for them to put all of these bans and be so anti cannabis that they were indeed practicing self-deception. I paraphrased it, I hope, somewhat well.
Yes, you definitely did paraphrase it well. David Lange, his name's pronounced Lange, even though it's spelled Lang.
Okay.
He was the Shadow Attorney General and the Prime Minister of New Zealand, and he basically called out New Zealand's hypocrisy. Because for almost 100 years now, there's been the prosecution of people who are using cannabis, but there's been a steady increase in the amount of alcohol that's being consumed, to the extent that 1 in every 10 New Zealanders is actually classified as an alcoholic, according to the National Addiction Centre there. So when 10% of the population are alcoholics, the country has a very severe drinking problem.
And that's just on the books. Obviously it's probably much greater than that.
I would say the problem is more extensive than that, because that figure of 10% is not talking about the binge drinking problem, which is another factor entirely. So you may not be an alcoholic if you're a binge drinker, and I think that there are probably possibly as many as 5% that you could add to that who are binge drinking, to a dangerous extent. Maybe not every weekend, but a couple of times a month they are, very inebriated, and the social ramifications of that are immense. The cost to New Zealand, which is a very small country, by the way, there's only just over 4 million people in New Zealand, and the cost of excessive drinking in that country is $16 billion each year. 85% of weekend crime is committed by people who have been drinking, and 50% of the murders in that country are committed by people who are intoxicated. So, you know, So alcohol is actually, according to Professor David Nutt, who we interview in Drug Lord, it's actually the most dangerous drug of all of the drugs, legal or illegal, because of its social harm and the harm to the user itself. It's actually more dangerous than heroin. So,
very interesting.
When looked at scientifically. So, you know, based on that, heroin should be legal and alcohol should be illegal. But of course, our drug laws are not based on science, and they're not based on reason or validated by the actual harms that the drugs are causing. It's mainly historical traditions that are the foundation of our drug laws. That being that Western societies embraced alcohol, and Western societies colonized most of the places on Earth, or if not directly colonized, influenced the cultures of most of the countries on Earth. And so alcohol has been accepted in most places and is legal in most places, whereas cannabis is illegal in just about every country in the world, with a few exceptions such as North Korea. That's something that we'll mention in Drug Lord too. But North Korea is actually one of the most progressive countries in the world when it comes to cannabis. People are allowed to grow it and smoke it, and there's no penalties whatsoever for doing so.
Wow, I would have never thunk.
In fact, here's an interesting little tidbit. People are encouraged to smoke cannabis instead of smoking tobacco, which they've realized is causing more problems than cannabis. And nobody's ever died from smoking cannabis in the entire history of its use, which dates back to, well, arguably 30,000 years that they've discovered cannabis in leather pouches in graves of shaman buried in Siberia. And they've therefore been able to date the use of cannabis to as far back as 30,000 years. And nobody has ever died from it that we know of. And 6.3 million people die every year directly from the use of tobacco. So tobacco is a far more deadly drug. In fact, it's the most deadly drug in terms of its death count in the world today. But you can walk into just about any shop in New Zealand, any dairy, any supermarket. I'm not sure what the situation is in the States now, but it's probably much the same. And you can buy tobacco, which will kill you it'll kill 50% of the people who ever start smoking. Mm-hmm. So no other drug has got a profile that dangerous, and yet there are very few social stigmas around using it. If you're a cigarette smoker, you may have to go outside in certain places to consume your drug, but you can smoke and drive. You can, smoke with your children in the car, for that matter. And 600,000 people a year die from secondary smoke inhalation. 1/3 of those are children. So there's an enormous amount of hypocrisy when it comes into the drafting of the drug laws, where tobacco and alcohol are always, or almost always, exempt from the same kind of classification models that the illicit drugs are classified through.
Mm-hmm. Now with tobacco, I've never smoked a cigarette in my entire life, and I also heard the statistic on your documentary that said anyone who tries smoking, about a 40% chance that they will become a lifetime smoker, or something along those lines, or addicted to tobacco. Is that correct? First of all, I think it was 40%.
That's right.
Okay, and then
That's correct. So
my question is, go ahead. Are you there? Uh-oh.
Oh, well, I was going to say 40% of people who ever try a single cigarette will become addicted, and then 50% of those people will die. In other words, 1 out of every 5 people who ever tries a cigarette will die from tobacco.
And
which is an enormously high death rate. I mean, it's high heroin.
We're having we're just having a little bit of audio difficulties, but it's fine. We're going to power through. So I apologize for stepping on you there. Mike, being a non-smoker, I've heard a lot and seen a lot of arguments for tobacco. I know this is not what the show is about, but just on a side note, that the tobacco industry, that the tobacco plant itself isn't quite as harmful as it is with all of the additives that are added into the commercialized product, including obviously the nicotine, which I don't know much about the cigarette in general or tobacco, but, because I'm thinking, tobacco itself is a plant. So I'm assuming that it wouldn't be that harmful without all the additives, but I really don't know. Any ideas? I apologize for putting you on the spot there.
No problem. Just because something is natural doesn't mean it won't kill you. Okay. There are a lot of plants that if you smoke them or ingest them in one form or another will kill you, and some will kill you very quickly. But you are correct in essence in saying that it's the additives that make tobacco a lot more deadly than what it would be if it was just cured the traditional way, without adding things like ammonium, which they're still doing, even though they were exposed in front of a grand jury. The 7 CEOs of the biggest tobacco companies were brought before a grand jury to testify whether or not they believed that tobacco was addictive, and they all lied under oath and said, no, tobacco is not addictive, when every single one of those CEOs had commissioned various forms of chemical adulterants to be added and scientific research to be conducted to find out how those additives were increasing the addictive properties of tobacco. So they were lying under oath, and one of the things that they were adding to the cigarettes to make it more addictive, to intentionally make it more addictive to the consumer, to make sure that consumers bought more of their product, was ammonium, which is actually a deadly chemical. It's a cleaning product. It's what you use to clean your floor. This ammonium is actually making tobacco far more harmful than what it would be if it was just cured the natural way that it was done during the 1800s.
Very interesting. And I'm assuming that nicotine affects neurotransmitters and draws the person to continue smoking maybe more than, say, if a person was a tobacco smoker, and we're going to move on from tobacco here in a second, but if a person was a tobacco smoker who grew their own tobacco, et cetera, I'm assuming that, they're going to not be smoking 3 packs a day. You know what I mean? I'm pretty sure that they would regulate a little more because they'd probably be getting their fix, whereas the additives not only are more harmful in the absorption of said smoked plant, but and again, we're talking about tobacco for a quick second, people. And also with the addictive side additives that are adding to it. So I just think, I can't imagine it being good for you at all. I've never smoked. I'm actually allergic to the tobacco plant. So I've been very lucky in that way because everyone who knows me knows I would have been a chain smoker for sure. So, anyway. Okay. Any other, we're going to probably revisit tobacco, but any final thoughts on tobacco for the short term before we get into a little bit more about alcohol?
Well, just a couple of other points. I mean, you could go on about tobacco for another 3 hours because it's a very interesting drug. The way that it does cause addiction and also the additives that they put in it to make people smoke more. For example, sulfur is added to nicotine, to tobacco, in order to make it burn faster. So as it's burning faster, first of all, you're going through your cigarette a lot quicker because a lot of it is just going up into the atmosphere. But you're also compelled to toke on it a lot faster because it's burning down quicker. So you don't want to waste it. So that's one of the things that they've been adding to cigarettes to make consumers consume more of it. And it's also one of the reasons why people chain smoke. It's because of the sulfur that's added to the cigarette.
Very interesting. Wow. Okay, so, and a lot of people, again, nobody's died from long-term cannabis smoking. We don't know of anything.
Which is not to say that some people aren't harmed by it. I don't want people to come away from this thinking that, cannabis cannot harm me. It probably won't. But you may be in that minority of people who does feel some negative side effects from it. So it shouldn't be a kind of a the film does not advocate that people smoke cannabis. It doesn't do that at all.
Correct.
But it does point out that there are other drugs that are going to kill you a lot quicker. In fact, cannabis can't kill you that we know of. Nobody's ever died from it, which is, as I said, not proof that nobody's never been harmed from it, because clearly there are people who shouldn't be smoking cannabis, and there are people who should be smoking less cannabis than what they're doing. But the interesting thing is that it doesn't seem to be affecting lung function. In fact, it might even be improving lung function for a lot of people. So in terms of its harms profile, cannabis is a fairly benign drug, although there are other drugs that are even more benign, which are more powerful, which is quite interesting, which Professor Nutt in the film touches on. But things like LSD and ecstasy are actually less harmful than cannabis. So very interesting that you know, these are so tightly.
We're just having a little bit of audio.
Actually less harmful.
Let's see if we can start that.
Okay. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, let's start the thought over, if you don't mind. Let's see. We were at LSD
sure.
and ecstasy.
Well, LSD, for example, rates number 18 on the Drugs Harms Index that Professor Nutt's team created. Cannabis rates number 11. Tobacco is number 6, and alcohol is number 1. So if you think about how tightly controlled LSD is, it doesn't warrant being so tightly prohibited, when in actual fact it's not going to harm the average person at all. You know, it may cause hallucinatory effects and so forth, but those are temporary, and once the LSD has been metabolized into your body, there are no long-term effects from it. In fact, there might be a lot of positive effects from it, especially with the treatment of things like PTSD. And for people who are dying, it seems to be very helpful to give hallucinogenic drugs to these people so that they can come to terms with what's happening to them. So these are the drugs that are most tightly controlled, and they're also drugs that are very low in terms of the harms that they can cause the user, and have incredible benefits. So the drug control models that we have are actually causing a lot of harm in themselves, not just in terms of the fact that you can be arrested for possessing a lot of these drugs, including cannabis, but also you're denied access to something that might be very beneficial to your life.
Exactly. And there was a very well-described domino effect regarding it being illegal to have cannabis on your person, et cetera. We're going to get into that in a little bit. I wanted to quickly address on as a like an adversary point for a second. With ecstasy, I will say that unfortunately, the ecstasy that is often found on the streets, at least in my small frame of reference, is now cut with meth or with other additives. So a lot of So that's the only thing. So when you're talking about ecstasy, we're talking about the MDMA, I think that's what it's called, and whatever else is in ecstasy, that is the, I know that MDMA is a part of ecstasy, but anyway, as long as you're not getting, bad cut drugs, I'm assuming that ecstasy is also, somewhat, beneficial for the hallucinogenic, prescription type thing, prognosis, diagnosis.
It was a prescription medicine, actually. It was used in marriage counseling, and in the treatment of PTSD. But it's a very good point, that you make. When talking about ecstasy, I was earlier referring to pure ecstasy and not the adulterated form that you get on the streets, which is a product of prohibition. Because if you were to go into a clinic to get not just ecstasy, but whatever you may need, be it LSD or whatever, you would be getting something that was produced under laboratory conditions. When you buy it in a back alley, you have no idea what's in it. And a lot of the deaths related to ecstasy, the people who didn't take ecstasy. They took something that they thought was ecstasy.
Right.
And it was the adulterants that killed them. Pure ecstasy almost certainly will not kill you. And if people were educated in the use of it, then the likelihood of you dying reduces even further. In fact, as David Nutt points out, peanuts are more dangerous than ecstasy to the average person. So, but I would also like to point out to your listeners that ecstasy has its own harms in terms of how it's produced, because it's produced from the sassafras tree. The sassafras tree, which is now an endangered tree because of poaching. In Southeast Asia, these trees are cut down and boiled to remove the sassafras oil, which is then sold on the black market. But again, if ecstasy were not illegal, then that kind of activity would be controlled, and you could even have plantations of these trees supplying the ecstasy market. So prohibition is actually the problem there. Again, it always comes down to the fact that the black market can't be controlled, and it has all of these knock-on consequences that are unintended. So when you are taking ecstasy, bear in mind that it wasn't produced entirely in a laboratory. Part of it was a natural product that is now becoming endangered because of the black market and the market for ecstasy in general.
Wow, very interesting. Okay, that's a very interesting point. I appreciate you bringing that up. The sassafras tree, who knew? Okay, so next hour you're talking about I want to get into the domino effects of criminalizing, say, cannabis. We're going to do this next hour, and also let's see, what was it? Oh, the positive effects of legalizing marijuana and decriminalizing cannabis, because there are just so many things. It doesn't have the effect where everybody's going to go rampant and run and use it. And you in your documentary point out a couple of really great examples. One being the Netherlands, and a second example would be the country of Portugal. So I suppose we could start to touch on it right now. Portugal was not. The Netherlands has been cannabis friendly for a long time. I'm assuming. I'm hoping you have the date. Portugal, not so much. They had a huge crime, drug crime aspect to the country. It was a terrible thing. A lot of people, it was rampant. A lot of violence, a lot of killing, a lot of drugs, all that kind of stuff. Portugal, if you want to tell the listeners, what did they do in response to this problem that they had?
Well, Portugal was being overrun by drugs because it's actually a port of call for smugglers. It's basically a way of getting illegal drugs into Europe. So drugs were very prolific and very cheap there, and they realized that they had lost complete control of it, and decided to decriminalize all drugs. So not just cannabis, but all drugs. Possession of any drug in Portugal is not a crime. You're referred to treatment if you are caught with drugs. There are no penalties at all. The results of decriminalizing drugs has been dramatic. In fact, they've decreased drug use by 50%, and they've decreased the costs of drug use to the society by 50%. So they've also decreased things like HIV infection rates by 50%. So there's been enormous benefits from decriminalizing cannabis and other drugs as well. The whole fear mongering movement that grew up around Portugal during the time it was introducing these new legislative decriminalization moves was that it's going to become the drug capital of Europe. They were using terms on television news like it's going to be a drug mecca. And the exact opposite of what was predicted happened, and drug use declined, and Portugal has now gained control of that entire problem, despite the fact that it's still a gateway for drug traffickers into Europe. And if a country where drugs are very prolific can reverse the tide of drug use so dramatically, then in countries like New Zealand, which is an island and which is they've got very good border controls, and they would have even more success with it. One of the prime reasons for it is that if you can go to a clinic and get treatment instead of being put in jail, you're more likely to have a positive outcome should you have some kind of drug dependency issue. You don't get very, very good treatment for addiction in prisons. In fact, the opposite tends to happen. And you can access the same drugs that you got on the streets in the prison itself. So if you can't control drug use in a high security facility, how can society and at large be expected to control drug use?
Well, very nice. We're going to be back for another hour, everyone. Stick around for Arik Reiss, my guest tonight, the creator of the documentary film Drug Law. We'll be right back in a few minutes. Welcome back to the show, everyone. I'm Angela Black. The show is called At This Moment every Thursday night, 10 p.m. Eastern / 7 p.m. Pacific, for a couple of hours of a wild ride with amazing guests, including tonight's. And I just want to let you know that we are listener supported. Please do find the donate button at the side of the chat room or the site support button at the top of the homepage, freedomslips.com. Again, if you're listening out there in other forms, well, hello to you out there, and please do find yourself at our homepage at some point. I know you love what you're listening to. And subscribe to the archives. I can't explain it to you. And, of course, we have the seed packs available, and in a perfect world, one day, maybe some of those seeds, and it's not now, but maybe one of those days, some of those seeds in the seed packs for your donation will include, who knows, some really awesome plant that we're talking about here. I'm here with Arik Reiss, the creator and filmmaker of the documentary film called Drug Lawed. That's DRUGLAWED. And if you can find this film at druglawed.com. And you can download it for $4.20. Hello, it's $4.20. So please do that. And I'm looking forward to a second hour of awesomeness. Everybody is talking to me from behind the scenes and telling me what a great show it is. So thank you so much for joining me tonight, Arik.
Thanks for having me, Angela.
Yeah, great stuff. Wow, it's been so informative. And the chat room right now is talking, remember we were talking about Mother Mary Joseph Aubert? Well, Miss Aubert in the chat room was saying that she actually has a sassafras tree. And yeah, and that they use it. It's one of the ingredients, I believe, in gumbo. So which is a stew. I'm not sure if you're familiar with gumbo, but
yes, I've had gumbo.
Yeah,
apparently I had when I was in New Orleans.
Oh, exactly. It would be the perfect place to have gumbo. So, okay, before we get back into all of it, so you travel around the world, and where have you been, and what, in general, what do you think about certain cities or certain countries? I'm just wondering, off the top of your head, what comes to mind?
I have traveled quite extensively. I've spent 7 months in the States. Which was a very interesting experience. I really like Boston, actually.
My husband's favorite city, yes.
Oh, yeah. And Austin, Texas, I thought was great. I've been to kind of some far-flung places which have an actual cannabis-related history. Ethiopia, which is originally where Rastafarianism came from, although it evolved mainly in Jamaica, but it's based around essentially the worship of the last Ethiopian emperor, whose tomb I was very fortunate enough to visit. That's Haile Selassie. My experiences in Ethiopia were very interesting. Making a documentary there too, that was about GMO, but it was from the other perspective. It looked at kind of the positive effects of the genetic modifications that they're using in Ethiopian agriculture. Oh. It kind of opened my eyes because before that I was quite opposed to genetic modification, and then I realized, well, it's actually not quite as black and white as I had thought, and there are some genetic modifications that are actually very positive. Yeah. So I've been to quite a few countries. And did you say you did a documentary on the positive side of GMO? I was part of I wasn't the director. I was the camera assistant. So it was actually a UK Channel 4 documentary.
Well, that's very interesting because, of course we're all anti-GMO, but, I'm talking about Terminator seeds. I'm talking about, intrinsic pesticides inside the seeds. That's bad. But obviously, most plants, that we consume today, as food, a lot of those have been modified, including corn. I mean, corn was not on Earth until it was modified from, I believe, wheatgrass, if I'm not mistaken, from wheat. And so, it is true that there are positive aspects of GMO, and I'm glad you brought that up, actually. And people are, of course, talking about GM cannabis and if that's good or bad. And, as long as I believe it doesn't contain the words Monsanto or Syngenta, I think we're batting about maybe 50-50. So, all right. Well, that's cool. There's a little place in LA, a street, I think it's Fairfax, and if you head south far enough, it's Little Ethiopia. And I was able to go there a couple of times and just hang out with the culture there, and it was pretty cool, I have to admit. And I don't know, it's just really, really warm, wonderful people, great food, all that fun stuff. So just amazing. That's cool. And you are a citizen, I believe you were born in South Africa? Is that correct?
I was born in Israel. I grew up in South Africa, and I recently became a New Zealand citizen.
Wow. So that's so interesting. It is, here's me, Miss American, et cetera. So it's very interesting, to meet you. And so you are, back home for a short while, I guess. Where do you reside, in general when you're not filmmaking, if that ever occurs?
I'm not sure I can answer that question. I'm kind of in a state of flux at the moment. My next destination will be Uruguay because I want to go there to make, to film the documentary there, the sequel, because they are the first country in the world to fully legalize cannabis on a national scale. So although I mentioned earlier that cannabis is legal in North Korea, they don't actually have a regulatory framework for it. So there's just no laws against it. But in Uruguay, there are laws to structure its production and distribution. And in fact, the government itself is the distributor of cannabis. So it's a very interesting test case for other countries to follow. And they're experiencing very positive results. They're getting revenue from it, which is the main benefit from legalizing it, because currently all of the profits go to the black market. When you regulate it, as they've done in Colorado, there's an enormous boon in terms of the taxes that you can levy on it, and also in terms of employment, because you're you're not creating a new industry. You're basically taking an underground industry and now creating a above ground industry, which has benefits in and of itself.
Excellent. And Uruguay, is that Uruguay? How do I say it correctly?
Either way.
Okay.
Uruguay.
Well, now, if I'm not mistaken, they stood up against the UN decision. I believe that was done in 61. The UN. Let's see. I can't remember the name of it right now. I'm looking through my notes.
Convention on Narcotic Drugs.
Yes. Thank you. Would you like to elaborate a little bit about that? And and Uruguay is the first country to stand up against that and just basically say we're not following that, even though the UN imposed that upon their country. They just stood back and just said we're not doing that. So it's very interesting. It can be done. In other words.
Oh yes, I mean the UN conventions. It seems to be that politicians and diplomats will accept certain conventions or certain aspects of certain conventions when it suits them, and when it doesn't, they just reject them. So it's not like the UN can invade Uruguay and force them to follow any of the conventions that they've signed, and the same goes for any country. So the conventions are used by politicians especially in New Zealand, to say, no, we're not going to experiment with our cannabis laws because we are signatories to these international conventions. But the example of Uruguay demonstrates that the conventions can actually be ignored. And when that happened, the UN sent them threatening letters and demanded that they reverse course. And the president of Uruguay at that time, Jose Mujica, just said, no, it's not in our interest to do so, and we're just going to go ahead with the legalization of cannabis. And the UN was completely powerless to stop them.
Very interesting. And a great point. Because, Uruguay obviously is not a nation of a lot of means, and would be considered a poor nation, I'm assuming. And for them to stand...
Actually, they're quite affluent.
Oh.
They've got the highest standard of living in South America.
Oh, I did not know that.
Uruguay is a very successful little nation. They're one of the few countries that didn't suffer an economic collapse back in 2008. They've got a very good agricultural sector. They've got a very progressive constitution. They're actually in 2013, The Economist magazine voted them Country of the Year.
Wow. See, I did not know that. So thank you for telling me that. And obviously they're creating more profit now for their domestic, for the gross domestic product, I should say. Is that the right word? GDP? Yeah. By legalizing and being able to tax marijuana or cannabis. So I'm sure that certainly doesn't hurt their economy.
Oh, no, definitely not. And you save an enormous amount of money by not prohibiting cannabis, because all of the resources that are currently wasted in most of the countries in the world, with the police, with the courts, with the prisons that are, filled up with cannabis users and other drug users, all of that gets allocated towards hospitals and education, and infrastructure. And not only that, but when you're taxing cannabis, you're getting revenue from cannabis instead of wasting all of that money.
And also, I don't think that it's a good idea to have, say, developing children consuming a lot of marijuana, aka cannabis. But when one country or one standard happens to where it may be legalized, what happens is you don't have that kind of puts the drug dealer of sorts out of business and tempting the kids early on and getting to them, because it's not taboo and it's not, it's somewhat out in the open. So therefore with the regulation would be a positive effect in not having overuse in the youth.
Oh, absolutely. In the case of the Netherlands, where it's been de facto legal at the point of sale since the 1970s, demonstrates that they have the lowest teenage rates of cannabis use in the European Union.
Isn't that interesting? That is so interesting.
And in Colorado, they found that use amongst kids has actually decreased. So when you remove the taboo and the temptation and the rebellious aspect of using it, the use amongst kids actually goes down.
That is so awesome. Because in your, and then I guess they tried it in West Auckland, you want to get into the dactory a little bit? Tell me.
Yeah, sure. That's a very interesting part of New Zealand's recent history. A man named Dr. Green, that's the name that he adopted legally, got out of prison after serving, a couple of years for production of cannabis. He was so angry at the state for imprisoning him that he resolved while he was in prison to open New Zealand's first cannabis club, and he did exactly that. And I ended up living there for 1 year when I was making this film, and filming the goings on there, and quite interesting police interactions that we had. There were certain policemen that were actually very sympathetic and almost supportive of what was going on there, because they understood that there wasn't really anything harmful happening there, and in actual fact, a lot of the problems of West Auckland with regards to the tinny houses, that's the New Zealand equivalent of a drug house. I'm not sure what you call them in the US. Not exactly a crack house, but where you can get illicit drugs. A lot of those problems decreased because people were gravitating towards the dactory, which was a semi-official place where people could come and relax and get their weed, instead of going to, the tinny houses, which were selling them adulterated weed a lot of the time. Sometimes they were adding methamphetamine to the weed. They were recoloring the weed that had been sprayed with herbicides that the police spray on the plants, and it turns the plants blue. But what the gangs in the tinny houses were doing were adding yellow dye to return the green color to the cannabis, and then selling that. People were then smoking this very poisonous cannabis, and so the police realized, well, at the dactory this isn't happening. And a lot of them came around and said, look, we know what you're doing here, and we're okay with it. We'll actually tell you when we want to come back to visit, just so that you know and you can prepare and you can hide the weed. Then a new wave of cops was sent in after there was a change of government from the Labour government, which happened in 2008, to the national government in 2009. There seemed to be a shift, and then all of the sympathetic cops in the area were relocated, and they sent in some hard noses to crack down on the place. And they raided about 18 times, actually, and put Dr. Green in prison, which is where he currently is, serving a 2.5-year sentence.
That is just it's just a tragedy. It really is. And so I obviously think that he's, they're going to come back with a vengeance in a positive way. I don't think the anger and revenge is necessarily going to fuel his next moves, but it'll be very interesting to see what his name is. Dactor, is that correct?
Yeah, D-A-K-T-A, Dr. Green.
Yeah, Dr. Green. So it'll be very interesting to see what he does when he gets out, and how he will maneuver around them, keeping a close eye on him, obviously. So, and now speaking of sympathetic police force and the hypocrisy that goes on there, one of the first things in your documentary that you explore is that New Zealand is a very alcohol saturated country, and a lot of the luring of college students to university is advertised by, say, a beer company or whatever. It's kind of synchronistic, I think, or I think synchronistic is close. Synergy, etc. And so I was watching this very, very interesting thing. So in 2009, I believe that was the year of this particular riot that happened. And it was happening simultaneously as like a get-together for cannabis smokers. And yes. So, if you want to tell about that, that'd be very interesting for the listeners to hear.
Well, Dunedin, which is the town where the riot took place, has actually got a tradition of rioting by students who are drunk. Where they really tear the town apart, set things on fire, cars, couches, telephone poles, trees. In the movie, you'll see them rip a tree out of the ground and drag it through the streets and dump it on a fire that's burning in the middle of the street. What happens is the students get together en masse, thousands of them, drink in the streets to the point where they are aggressively violent. The police get drawn in. They attack the police. Then they have to bring in riot squads. The year that we were there filming, there must have been 120 to 150 police in full riot gear, attacking, being attacked by the students and then counter-attacking the students. There were 80 arrests that on one night, and the riots took place over 2 nights. The following night, there was a few more arrests, less than the first night, but it was basically a street battle of drunk students versus riot police. And just a few blocks away, there was the Otago normal student body's 6th birthday party, where there was maybe 100 or so people smoking cannabis, and the atmosphere was very jovial and peaceful. And the contradiction between these two gatherings is very obvious in the film, where you see the police arrive at the stoners party, and they're engaged with in a very civil way, and the stoners are just chatting with the police, and eventually the police realize there's nothing for them to do there, even though there are people breaking the law, and they just leave, and the same policemen are called to the riot just a few blocks away, where they're having bottles thrown at them by this throng of angry students. So it basically juxtaposes the harms and the effects of these two drugs perfectly. It was just a gift from the documentary gods that these two events took place on the same night in such close proximity.
Yeah, I was going to say, I was hoping that all was your footage, and how fortunate, even though there was, issues going on at the alcohol riots thing, which of course brings to light the resources that were called and spent on fighting this supposedly acceptable and legal, well, it is legal, but supposedly acceptable, drug of sorts, alcohol. And how much of the country's or the city's resources were, there's money, there's time, there's energy, there's injury, all that happening, destruction of property, it just goes on, and it's unfortunate that seems to be swept under the rug. And a big component, a big proponent of alcohol being acceptable and cannabis not being acceptable is a gem of an individual named Peter Dunn.
The Associate Minister of Health.
Yeah, what a gem.
Well, Peter Dunn is I think one of the world's biggest hypocrites, because he's been taking donations from the tobacco industry, from the gambling industry, from the alcohol industry, and probably from the pharmaceutical industry, although I don't have proof about that, but certainly alcohol, tobacco, and gambling, which are 3 of New Zealand's most detrimental vices. And every time there's a vote in Parliament to curb the ability of the tobacco and alcohol and gambling industries to profit from their vices, Peter Dunn stands up in their defense. And every time there's a vote in Parliament to relax the cannabis laws, to make it easier for people to access medicinal cannabis in particular, Peter Dunn cheerleads the opposition. And his son is actually the guy who he gave the very lucrative contract to draft New Zealand's synthetic cannabis laws, and he is now the legal consultant to the legal highs industry. Which is just another aspect of his hypocrisy, because the so-called legal highs are far more deadly and far more harmful than natural cannabis. So he's created this demand for legal highs by legalizing them. He's recently retracted the laws, which means that now the industry that he's created has been driven underground. New Zealand has a very big problem with synthetic cannabis, although I should point out that what is referred to as synthetic cannabis is often not cannabis, synthetic or otherwise at all. It's just a concoction of essentially research drugs that have been sprayed onto some smokable plant matter, and you really have no idea what it is that you're consuming when you smoke these research chemicals. And there have been deaths related to this. I think there's been 4 deaths so far What happened was he kept the natural cannabis industry underground and kept the prosecutions and the repression of that side of it. He kept that up, and he created the legal highs industry, which has created all kinds of problems, including a lot of presentations in hospitals of people who have lost their minds. They've completely flipped out, and they've presented with psychiatric problems, some of which are irreversible.
Wow, and it would obviously serve the idea that cannabis is bad for you for anyone who wants to maneuver or manipulate that data. Obviously, it's and how horrible that these people are, ending up with terrible outcomes after smoking what they think is going to be some type of legal natural substitute for marijuana, and indeed it's not. It's a synthetic test ground, is what you're telling me.
Yeah, exactly.
Really?
It's the entire problem that has arisen in the last 5 to 8 years would be completely obviated by legalizing natural cannabis, which doesn't have this dangerous profile, and it's fairly understood what it is that you're ingesting when you smoke or eat or vaporize cannabis, compared to these chemical adulterated substitutes, which when they were available in shops in New Zealand, there was no listing of the ingredients or the components that went into manufacturing these products. It wasn't required by law for the manufacturers to stipulate what was in them. And when they occasionally did, it was some complex chemical formula that the average person will have no understanding of what that thing is. Even if they go on the internet, they're not going to be able to discover what some of these things are. So it was basically a free-for-all for several years there, and a lot of people got very rich, and now those people have moved their industry underground, and they're importing their substrates from China and from other countries, and cooking it up illegally and distributing it through the tinny houses.
Wow. That's bad.
Oh yeah, it is bad. It is bad. I mean, synthetic cannabis substitutes are not synthetic cannabis. They are synthetic cannabis is fairly safe. Nobody has ever died from actual synthetic cannabis, but from the so-called synthetic cannabis, there are recorded deaths.
Wow. I want to take this over to, since we're talking about synthetic drugs, etc. I kind of want to jump over to pharmaceuticals for a minute and talk about that, because the three legal drugs, the three legal drugs, obviously that are nationally legal for the most part, I think, is alcohol, tobacco, and pharmaceuticals, which is of course a whole, that's a very loose term for a whole range of different, class A's, class B's, class C's, whatever they are, just harmful things. So the pharmaceutical industry, along with the oil industry, the paper industry, a few other industries that you had mentioned earlier, the pharmaceutical industry obviously is not interested in legalizing or decriminalizing cannabis. Now, I know we have some recreational states that are now happening here in the United States, but we're still looking at a globe here. Well, if indeed you are a person who believes in it's a globe. But anyway, internationally, I will say, Big Pharma is huge. It's absolutely huge everywhere, and what an evil empire that is. So if you wanted to just go into, you had a really informative guy on your, well, a lot of people were very informative, but on your documentary, I don't remember his name right here.
Was it Rick Doblin?
Yeah, it could have been, yes. Yeah. I watched him. So they were talking, maybe he was, about pharmaceuticals and the harm that is caused, and just in general, if you want to elaborate for our listeners, anything that you might have to add.
Sure. Pharmaceuticals are the third leading cause of drug deaths after tobacco, which is number 1, and alcohol, which is number 2. And if you put it in perspective, the possibility of dying from a pharmaceutical drug due to an overdose or due to some misuse or due to the interactions of combining these drugs is actually very high. So things like OxyContin, for example, and all the various brand names that it's sold under, is a highly addictive drug. And the pharmaceutical companies are actually releasing forms of the pill that they know will create greater addiction problems. And the FDA has approved these pills. So I've actually seen pharmaceutical drug addicts crushing these pills and snorting them the way you'd snort cocaine.
I know a few. I know a few people who do that,
yeah,
yes.
I've also seen these pills being crushed and cooked up in a spoon the way you'd prepare heroin and being used intravenously, which the pharmaceutical companies can actually prevent. They can create pills that are manufactured in such a way that you cannot use them in these forms. They cannot be crushed and they cannot be dissolved. But instead, they know that these pills are being misused, and they're actually getting FDA approval to sell them on the open market. And in states like Florida, where you've got the pill mills, people can get literally thousands of opioid medications without very much trouble at all, and not only use them themselves, but then become distributors, black market distributors of these things, which are as powerful as heroin. So this is just one of the knock-on effects of the pharmaceutical industry being basically given a license to distribute very, very toxic sometimes and very potent drugs and very addictive drugs.
Wow. Yeah, it's terrible, and it's so profitable. I mean, they own, I believe, during I heard a figure on some documentary that I saw recently. It was that 70% of advertising revenues in mainstream media in the United States come from pharmaceutical companies during a non-election year. And I mean, that is just a staggering figure. And then the lobbyists, obviously, that keep the government officials in their pockets. And it's just a terrible mess. So to watch countries such as Portugal be able to turn it around when they were completely off the charts as far as drug crime, etc., and to make their society more sublime, if you will, on the way to sublime. Certainly not anything perfect, but it's really encouraging. I don't believe that it's because of the good of the people that the United States is starting to, drift over to recreational cannabis use. It's simply because it's very profitable. And one thing I wanted to get into is in your documentary, which you guys, it's Drug Laud, that's DRUGLAWED, druglaud.com. You can get the documentary for $4.20. That's $4.20. So just so you guys know, and I'm here with Arik Reiss. He is the filmmaker and is currently in the process of making Drug Laud 2, which, by the way, kudos to you for being a part of the solution here on this planet. Well done.
Thank you.
Let's see. And also shout out again to Vinny Eastwood, who apparently has a mini documentary on your mutual friend, Dr. Green. So I hope to look at that as well at some point. I did not know he did that. And that was really cool. What a cool guy that is. And I was really happy to see that. Okay. With the, mess, of criminalized cannabis, the amount of money and resources that are spent, not just, if you wanted to get into a little bit of that breakdown, you're looking at families who are suffering because the earner of their income is in jail. I mean, there's so many aspects to the extra money that really does not need to be spent. If you want to get into that a little bit, I'd appreciate it.
Sure. Well, if you think about the destruction that can be wrought on a family where one of the parents smokes cannabis or is growing cannabis or involved in cannabis in some way, the children can be taken away by child protection. the person can lose their job. They can be put in jail. They can have their medicine taken from them, and their health can suffer if they're using cannabis for medicinal purposes. Their house can be taken from them, can be seized under the Proceeds of Crimes Act. They have the lawyers' bills and the interruption to their lives of having to go to court. There are all of these flow-on costs that are really destructive, just to that family, but to their whole community. I mean, in some places in New Zealand, you have very high arrest rates, and sometimes you've got a very large percentage of people who've got criminal records. Those people are now unable to get student loans. They're unable to get public housing. They may be unable to get employment because they have to declare that they have a criminal record to their prospective employers. And so it just goes on and on and on. They'll be denied their right to travel to foreign countries. The impact to the individual and to the community and to the society at large it's immeasurable.
Yeah, they're destroying the family unit. I saw in particular an example of a couple that was, growing some cannabis in their garage or something like that because, maybe they need to make a few extra bucks and then they're criminalized for that if they get caught. So they have to, operate that under, the fear of being arrested and then their entire lives changing. It seems very useless, this whole thing. And one other thing that just a great documentary, by the way. I look at all this information I'm spouting out. It's fabulous. So another whole couple of industries or branches of a particular industry is fueled by the criminalization of cannabis, and that would be the prison industrial complex. And we're looking at private prison and how profitable that is, and don't forget the drug testing industry. So I found that to be a great point as well. I mean, these are industries that have sprouted up and become very successful, whereas the opposite of the equation is in the Netherlands. And if you want to tell our listeners about what's going on there with their prison systems.
Right. Well, in recent years, they've closed 19 jails.
Unbelievable.
In the Netherlands, and they're also subletting cells to other countries. So prisoners from Belgium and from, I think, Germany are actually sent to the Netherlands to serve time there because they don't have enough Dutch prisoners to fill the jails that are still open.
Isn't that interesting?
They have some of the lowest crime rates in Europe, and also they have the lowest rates of drug use in Europe. So this is a country where cannabis and actually not just cannabis, but magic mushrooms and a few other drugs are legally available in the coffee shops there. And they're saving an enormous amount of money, and they're actually gaining revenue from other countries whose prisoners they are housing.
Wow.
They're renting space in their prisons to other countries.
Unbelievable. That makes a lot of sense. That's logic. You know what I mean? That's logic. What we're looking at with especially in your country, not your country, one of the countries that you're a citizen of, New Zealand, and the focus of this particular documentary. So it makes perfect sense. It would solve so many issues. It really would. It's logic, and to make that happen is unfortunately a bit of a long process. We could get back into the other gem of a human, if you want, explore this. The drug czar, Anslinger. I wanted to get into a little bit of his history and how that's affected the U.S. and for that matter the global repercussions from the war on drugs. Nixon being the instigator of that whole thing. So could you just tell us a little bit about the gem man, the gem of a human, Anslinger?
Well, Harry Anslinger was the nephew-in-law of the Treasury Secretary Andrew Mellon.
Okay.
Who had interest in because he held patents petrochemical processes and was going to threaten became developed in the way that it would have if the technology had been used that they'd introduced at that time to process hemp, would have then made it very cheap to produce fuel from hemp and plastics. And so Anslinger and his uncle-in-law Andrew Mellon decided that they would ban hemp by demonizing cannabis, which they did very effectively by quoting the newspaper articles that were being released by
William Randolph Hearst. Yeah.
So what Anslinger's modus operandi was that he would fabricate a story, and the story would then be printed in one of the yellow press newspapers of William Randolph Hearst. Then Anslinger would hold up this false story in Congress and say, "Look what's happening. This Negro has smoked marijuana and killed a white family with an axe, and therefore it's proof that we need to ban all forms of cannabis, including hemp." That was literally what he did. He'd make up these stories and then quote them himself, and use that as the reason to ban hemp and cannabis. And
he remained the drug czar for 5 presidencies, correct?
That's right. He was the drug czar for 32 years. John Kennedy finally forced him to resign, but it didn't stop him from representing the U.S. at the United Nations. And he was then the person who drafted the 1961 Single Convention on Drugs, which is what 184 countries signed, basically adopting his reefer madness policies, not just on cannabis, but towards drugs in general. And that's how the drug laws from the U.S. got spread all over the world.
Wow. And the UN being very happy to listen to the U.S. because the U.S. at that time was responsible for funding about 1/4 of the income needed for the UN to exist, I guess. Is that correct?
That's correct. 1/4 of the funding for the UN came from the U.S.
Mm-hmm. Wow. And then we might as well bring up Nixon for a minute. And you had some great vintage recordings of Nixon just being a complete douchebag. Sorry, I get to say that. It's not on the list of 7 things I can't say. And, here's a guy that basically it was in his best interest to distract the public from, if you were anti-war at the time, chances are if you were a peaceful hippie of sorts, you might smoke marijuana, you might smoke cannabis. And so, and those were very vocal people against the war. And so what the agenda of Nixon was to distract the mainstream, population that was, subscribing to mainstream media, and not focus on what was being done by, these, dope smoking hippies, and instead turn it around. And those same people that are smoking this, cannabis were also very vocal on anti-war protests. And so this way, if you want to just elaborate, because he was able to arrest a lot of these people with free speech because of the cannabis laws. And if you want to just elaborate, better than me.
Sure. Well, it was just a very convenient coincidence that the peace movement during the Vietnam era happened to adopt cannabis as part of their counterculture identity. And so even though Nixon was advised to use treatment and rehabilitation as the main focus of their drug policy, he couldn't resist the opportunity that making harsh drug laws offered him to basically cut the legs out from under the anti-war movement. And so all of the marijuana laws and the drug laws that arose during his presidency were essentially not there as a means of dealing with the drug issue. It was there as means of dealing with the anti-war movement, and right. It was very effective. You can't arrest somebody for protesting against the Vietnam War, but if they have a joint in their pocket, you can arrest them. And so that was the underlying reason behind it.
Yeah, that really opened my eyes. These are things I conceptualized, but just to hear it put so eloquently and so concisely in your amazing documentary was just really. I went on a great mind trip, and I've learned so much in just a short period of time. So you've really done your audience and the planet a service by you don't come across as a pro. It's not. It's not necessarily self-agenda-driven pro-cannabis film. It really is in my opinion, an unbiased documentary that logically points to legalizing cannabis. And I feel that you didn't input your own personal thoughts, whatever they may be, into this film. And I thought you did a fine job. You were the exact opposite of William Randolph Hearst's yellow journalism.
Well, thank you. Yeah, we spent a lot of time researching it, and we did want to look at it from a sort of a dispassionate historical point of view, and just recount what actually happened and how these drug laws arose. And when you look at the nebulous figures who are standing behind the architecture of the drug laws, which is principally Harry Anslinger and Richard Nixon. Both of these men were psychopaths. I mean, they were deeply disturbed individuals that are on power trips, and it's very sad that their mentality has disseminated through the entire world, not just the United States, but it's gone way beyond. May
I just have you repeat that? We had some audio.
And their ideas.
Oh, we just had some audio issues
okay.
there. So you said it's very sad, and then we lost you.
Yeah. Oh, okay. It's very sad and disturbing that the philosophies of these two psychopaths has been adopted by almost every country in the world.
Yeah. Good point. Wow. So you guys can get this film. It's $4.20, which is a bargain. And I was encouraging my new friend Arik Reiss to eventually find this little tasty nugget of film on, say, Netflix or something like that. But in the meantime, you guys can download it for $4.20, which is it's nothing in your day. And of course, it's $4.20, so I mean it's got that energy to it. And it's at druglawed.com. That's DRUGLAWED.com. And yeah, I highly recommend the watch, people. It is so worth your couple of hours. It's not even a couple of hours. It's like 99 minutes, I believe. So yeah, definitely check out the film. And any other thoughts before we talk a little bit about your next film, Drug Lawed 2?
Just that I'm almost finished translating it into Spanish, so it will also be available with English subtitles for the hearing impaired. Although I doubt that many of your listeners are hearing impaired, or they wouldn't be listening to your show. But
Funny.
Yeah, it'll be available with Spanish and English subtitles soon as well.
That's great. Yeah, I actually, when I watch a film, I love to have subtitles available to me. There are a couple of times when I don't, such as if I'm watching a comedian or something, then I don't want to know what they're saying until he says it, looking for that cat. But other than that, I have to say, I love subtitles. It really helps the film. So that's great. Congratulations on that. That's a big task in itself. Okay, so we have about maybe 8 minutes left, and I wanted to ask you about your new film. So we talked about it a little bit at the beginning, that you're in Israel talking to scientists, because in Israel, I believe cannabis is legal for medical purposes.
That's right. There are 21,000 registered patients here, and they are on the cutting edge of cannabis science. In fact, the THC molecule was discovered here in the 1970s by Professor Raphael Meshulam, who I'm visiting at the University of Jerusalem next month.
Wow, I just got goosebumps. That's going to be an awesome meet.
Oh yeah. He's now in his mid-80s. He's still working every day. He's arguably the world's foremost expert on the cannabis plant, and he's surrounded by people who are also foremost experts on the plant. And I visited their dispensary in Tel Aviv 2 days ago. It's called Tikkun Olam, where they are supplied by cannabis farms. There are 3 or 4 cannabis farms, and I've got permission to visit 2 of them. So I'll be filming there, and they're very impressive in scale. Huge hangars with hundreds of thousands of plants, dozens of different genuses that they've created for specific medical ailments, and they're treating these ailments very effectively.
Wow. And so, are you going to be visiting other countries for your film? What else are you covering in the new Drug Lord 2?
Yes, I'll be in Uruguay, and I'm gonna hopefully be speaking to the former president there, Jose Mujica, who created the national regimen for cannabis in Uruguay.
Right. That'll be a wild ride.
Oh yeah, I'm looking forward to it.
Wow, is there any place on the planet you haven't been?
There are quite a few places, but I'll get to them.
Oh, I bet you will. I have a good feeling about it. So, let's see. Yeah, any other thoughts that you have for the listeners while we wrap up the show today? And it's been a great 2 hours. Thank you so much for waking up at like 4:30 in the morning Israel time to join me today.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me. Well, to the listeners, I encourage you to go to www.druglord.com, DRUGLAWED, and to download the film, because in doing so, you're supporting the production of the sequel here in Israel, and in Uruguay. And also tell your friends about it and encourage them to visit the website too.
Absolutely. And I'm now just giving the Wikipedia for your film, Drug Lord, in the chat. Let me just put that in here. Okay. So what's your day look like? I mean, your day's just starting. It's Friday morning for you. And what's on your schedule for the day? Are you doing some filmmaking, Arik?
I'm trying to organize a tripod and lights for next week's shoot at Tikkun Olam. And I am doing some research. I'm looking at their website right now and going through their archives of their news clippings. I see Montel Williams has visited the dispensary as well, and also their cannabis farm. So kudos to Montel for spreading the word.
Yeah, and doesn't he? I believe he suffers from fibromyalgia.
Yeah, that's right. He's a medical user.
Yeah, so that's interesting. Yeah, cool on Montel. And I just had another question. I lost it. Darn it. I will find it. Okay, so that's happening, and then you're meeting with the university man who discovered the THC molecule or cannabinoid.
That's right.
Yeah. Wow.
That's right.
And so you're going to be bringing to the table other molecules that have been discovered on your next documentary?
Yes, there are a whole bunch of, I'll drop some names on you. There's cannabigerol, there's cannabichromine, there's cannabidiolsoin. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right. There's a whole bunch of new molecules that they're discovering. Cannabicyclol, cannabicytrane, and they're discovering new uses for these cannabinoids as well. So I want to discuss with Professor Meshulam what the future is, and I'm sure he's going to have encyclopedic knowledge to share with not just me but with everyone, because he's going to be the star of the next film. Wow.
That's so exciting. It's just going to be mind-blowing. He's going to be so thrilled that you're on the planet, and you're going to be so excited to talk to him. And yeah, I'm thinking about skin cancer applications, any type of skin care, obviously pain, cancer treatment. The list goes on with the amazing benefits from the cannabis plant. And the hemp plant as well. I was looking at that about Henry Ford being a proponent of hemp and he was actually not a bad guy back then. I mean, he's kind of, I think the Ford Corporation sort of, went awry, but in the beginning, it seemed like he was a pretty darn good guy.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't know how many of your listeners are familiar with the term chemagy, but it was a school of industrial, belief that the substrates of all of the industrial processes should actually come from agriculture, not from mining. and that it's fallen away completely. I mean, the term is never used now, but it's a brilliant foundation, because it means that you don't have all of these pollutants and effluents and things like that are byproducts of the chemical industries and that we have today. The idea of being able to recycle a car that after it's been grown from the soil and been produced and is now obsolete, you can then turn it into fertilizer and grow the substrates for the next generation of cars. That was around in the 1930s. Ford was actually practicing that. His hemp car was biodegradable. Almost all of the parts of the car were made from bioplastics. So it would solve so many of the problems that we have today, including the fuel itself was grown from the soil and made from hemp, and it was carbon neutral. So you've got a car there that is completely green and completely sustainable, and all of that philosophy was lost during the 1930s when hemp was made illegal.
Wow. Well, that's the end of the show. Arik Reiss, everyone. If anyone else would like to interview Arik Reiss, hosts here at Revolution Radio, you can definitely contact me, and I will get you his information. I know he's doing other interviews and is interested in getting the word out for Drug Law and Drug Law 2. Thank you so much, Arik Reiss, for joining me tonight.
Pleasure to be here.
Okay.
Thank you for having me.
All right. Excellent. Everyone, it's Ground Control with Keith Azzi and Major Tom up next on Studio A, and we'll check you next week. The CBD aspect of which I think is the cannabinoid molecule that you're talking about. And then there's also the THC side. And I'm wondering if you can elaborate about the separation and how you see the separated items being cures or helping treat ailments, etc. What do you find with all your research that is the case? What do you see with the two? Yes, please ask. Please answer. I'll ask.
Well, of all the 65 cannabinoids, THC and CBD seem to be the main two. THC was the first one to be isolated by Professor Meshulam, and that's the one that typically gets you high and gives you the feeling of euphoria. And CBD, on the other hand, has no psychotropic effect. So you can smoke a CBD-rich joint or strain, and you won't feel the giggles or the munchies or any of those other symptoms of smoking cannabis ordinarily. Mm-hmm. And so this is a very positive development, because a lot of opponents of cannabis as medicine say, well, we can't use it because it'll get you high, as if that's a bad thing. Right. But if you're talking about CBD, there are no psychotropic effects, so you can use it without any fear, if that's the right word, of the psychological effects of normal cannabis. And also you can use it very safely with children. So they've discovered that it's extremely good for treating epilepsy. And so much so that the first person in the entire history of New Zealand since cannabis was made illegal in 1927 was recently given permission to use it. So there was a historic moment just a couple of weeks ago. Wow. When a teenager who was in an induced coma because his epileptic seizures were so severe that he was in danger of dying from them, he's been given permission by the Ministry of Health for the first time to use CBD oil that came from the United States. And
it's that time again. Welcome, everyone. I'm Angela Black. This show is called At This Moment here at Revolution Radio. freedomslips.com, the number one 100% listener-supported radio station on the planet and possibly beyond. And so if you are colonizing Mars in the near future, bring your Wi-Fi, because we're there too. And the way to keep this truth boat floating, of course, is to find the donate button at the side of the chat room, freedomslips.com, or the site support tab at the top of the homepage. And you can find yourself donating to the cause and receiving amazing prizes on the back end, including the subscription to the archives. I'm telling you, you're going to want to catch the archive to this show because there's going to be a lot of information discussed. I can't wait to tell you who my guest is, keeping it a secret for the next 1 minute. So anyway, you can subscribe to the archives for $5 a month. There are 2 studios going simultaneously all day long. And if you're a normal human who has one brain and a life, it's hard to listen to both studios at the same time. So for a mere $5 a month, you can subscribe and catch all the shows you missed yesterday, last week, last month, last year. How could you go wrong? And a special shout out to Nighthawk, the owner of the station here at Revolution Radio, all of the production staff, of course, the management staff. Hello, homies. What's up? And of course, my chatters. What's up? Not my chatters. I'm just one of you guys. But anyway, we're the chat room and it's a lot of fun. Hello to everyone out there and tune in on iTunes, Winamp, TalkStream Live, Shoutcast, however you find us. Hello, nice to see ya. And let's see, don't I look great on radio? I just want to say that. No. Okay, moving on. You can also look at the seed packs. Don't forget about those. You've got the $60 donation. You get yourself a bevy of seeds. The $100 most popular one-time donation does get you 34,500 seeds. And yes, you know what that means? Self-sufficiency. Correct. All right, and unfortunately, the seeds that we're going to be talking about in the next 2 hours are not included in that seed pack, but maybe one day, just maybe one day they will be. I think you know what I'm talking about. Also, I would like to thank JP, Wolfman J, JP Prometheus over at Wolf Spirit Radio for simulcasting this show right now. Shout out to you, man. Thanks so much for bringing more radio to my day and everyone's day. You did a great job there taking over for Dave Corso, and the place wouldn't be the same without you, as you are working for both sister stations here. Vinny Eastwood in the house, looking at him right there in the chat room. Vinny, you're hanging out here at Revolution Radio again. Sounds like you want to come home. All right, so anyway, just teasing. But you guys, Vinny Eastwood, and I'm honored, by the way, just honored to have received a random, out of the blue Skype text from Vinny Eastwood saying, Angela, I've got a guest to send your way. Would you mind interviewing him? And I immediately said yes and knew that I would have a high caliber, amazing person with me in the virtual studio right now. And indeed I do. I got to watch the documentary today. I'm learning more and more. And so without further, and just to everyone I did not name in the chat room, you guys know I love you. And hopefully we can do that maybe at the top of the second hour. So I can't tell you how excited I am to introduce my guest to you. And it is not mispronounced, so I'm not going to mispronounce his name. And he is the filmmaker and creator of the documentary called Drug Lord, and his name is Arik Reiss. And so welcome to the show, Arik.
Thanks for having me, Angela.
Nice to see ya. All right, so you guys, now this gentleman is a citizen of 3 countries, so he's no slouch. He's all over the planet all the time, and it took him, I think, 4 years to do this documentary, and he didn't stop and take a rest like most people would do. He's continuing on his filmmaking journey and making the sequel to Drug Lord as we speak. Well, a little later on in the day. It is 5 o'clock in the morning in Israel right now, where I am talking to Arik, and it's very exciting. Many people might pronounce his name Arik Reiss, but indeed that is incorrect. So I want to say it right here so you guys can all say it with me. Let's do it together. Arik Reiss, the filmmaker of the movie Drug Lord, a wonderful documentary about the history of cannabis, and it's pawn piece, if you will. It's chess piece in the American war on drugs and how New Zealand became, unfortunately, a victim of just a lot of technocracy and a lot of government corruption, etc., corporatocracy, all kinds of things. So we're going to get into the history of everything, but I just let's start here. So you're in Israel right now, and what the heck are you doing there, Arik?
I'm here to meet with several of their scientists who are the pioneers in the field of medical cannabis, principally Raphael Mechoulam, who's the discoverer of the THC molecule and the anandamide component of the human body, which is the cannabinoid that the human body produces naturally, whether or not you've ever smoked a joint or had a medible you have cannabinoids coursing through your body throughout the entire length of your life. In fact, there's even cannabinoids in your mother's milk. So it's part of the human physiology. And the Israeli medical program discovered that. And they're using cannabis with amazing results to treat a number of diseases that previously were very difficult to treat. Wow.
And that using the cannabinoid, is that how you say it? Which is a molecule? Okay.
Well, yes. Principally, that's the active component of the cannabis plant. There are about 60 to 65. They're discovering new ones every day, but there are about 65 cannabinoids that they know of now, and each one has got a medicinal application.
Wow. That's really interesting. I know a little about some of this stuff, but I really look forward to the next 2 hours to learning a lot. So I didn't know that the human body has cannabinoid. Did I say it right?
Cannabinoid?
Cannabinoid. Okay, I got it. Cannabinoid. So it's in our bodies, and so that means it's not, an elite molecule of the cannabis plant.
Well, yeah, it's a curious thing that the human body, in fact, almost all mammals, I should say, and birds as well, and a lot of different other life forms on this planet, they all have cannabinoids in them because we share a common ancestor, that being the humble sea squib. And because we evolved over millions of years from sea squibs, we have this component in our bodies, and it's a very interesting coincidence that the cannabis plant produces a molecule that exactly mimics what we have internally.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And so, yeah, it's just a very strange coincidence of nature that a plant is producing the same molecules that we actually need for life. Without cannabinoids in our body, we'd actually die. The endocannabinoid system is the most extensive network in the body. There's cannabinoid receptors in almost every part of your body, from your skin to your lungs, obviously, to your brain. Your heart has cannabinoid receptor sites. It's an incredible system, and it regulates many of our bodily functions.
Wow. So obviously, if, say, through environmental factors or illness, etc., that this molecule and this recepticide, as you called it, yes, recepticide, did you say?
Yes, there are cannabinoid receptor sites which fit the cannabinoid molecules. That's correct.
Right. And so maybe a depletion of that happens somehow. So instead of using, say, poisonous pharmaceuticals, which we're going to get into that, people, the replacement of these cannabinoids in our body, it makes perfect sense. Yes? I mean, hello.
Yes, absolutely. Well, take spasticity, for example. That's caused by deficiency in cannabinoids. So when cannabinoids are introduced artificially through eating cannabis, through smoking it even, or vaporizing it, or you can even inject cannabis now. That's one of the things that the Israeli medical program has pioneered.
Wow.
Those receptor sites then become filled with cannabinoids, and spasticity stops or is greatly reduced. So they're finding that it treats things like epilepsy far more effectively than pharmaceutical medications, and with fewer side effects, actually.
Of course. So it's called spasticity?
Oh, spasticity.
Oh, spasticity, like spasta. Spasticity. Like, yeah. One of my nicknames in high school was Spangy for Spastic Angie, so. I see. So that's very interesting. Spasticity. Okay. So now let me ask a question before we continue to get rolling. We have the